Welcome, friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, and weird history. And today we have one of our favorite other types of podcast episode. We have an author interview today, and we have the absolutely wonderful Dr. Nikki Hayes. And she is the author of a new book, A Little History of Psychology. She's also a fellow of the British Psychology Society, and she has several other accolades that I cannot possibly list out right now. She's also the author of over 25 books and has been writing since 1984. And we are so happy to have you here, Dr. Hayes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to come.
It's great to have you. So she has just got off of a busy time in her life, so we're very lucky to have her here. And let's just dive right in, Dr. Hayes. Can you tell us, first of all, what is A Little History of Psychology all about?
Okay, it's about psychology as a science, because just about every human society has its own stories about what people are like and its own beliefs and things. But they didn't really become what we think of as psychology until science happened, and that wasn't really until the sort of 17th 18th century in the West, and so it's really an account of how psychology began and how it developed from there. But it never had a single origin. It wasn't like physics or something like that. I mean, psychology has always had several different strands that it brings together.
So there's no like Newton or the person who created this type of thing. When we think of psychology, often like Freud or the other guy. What is his name? I cannot remember.
You're probably thinking of William James or Wilhelm Wundt. Those are the two founding fathers.
Okay. Those other ones. So you wouldn't really consider them being, I guess, the creators of psychology?
Oh, I think you would. Would you?
Okay.
Yes, I think that those are definitely. I seem to remember the publisher saying to me, psychology seems to have more than one founding father, and I said, that's how it is, and you can draw your own conclusions about that metaphor. But yes, it's Freud certainly. Wilhelm Wundt was the person who set up the first psychological laboratory, so that was important because he was one of the first to establish it as a science within a university. And then William James, of course, wrote the key textbook in psychology, which affected the American audience so much. I mean, there was they didn't share the same views of what psychology is, and I write about that in the book as well. But that's sort of some of the origins. But then there were other origins too, because the people studying the brain, there were neuropsychologists. I mean, there was the really famous case of Phineas Gage, who was shall I talk about him?
Yes, I would love that.
Yeah, I mean, he was a railway worker, a supervisor, and his job was banging explosives into holes in rock so that they could then be set off and break the rock up so people could to make the railroad. And in America, and something went wrong. It went off prematurely, and his tamping iron, which was a long iron rod, went straight through his brain. It fired out straight through his brain. But what was amazing was that it didn't kill him. It went in just below the eye socket, went right through his brain, came out at the top, and he fell over. Obviously, he fell over, but he picked himself up after a few seconds, and he walked to the cart and drove him. I don't know whether he drove himself or was driven back to the place where he was staying, when he sat on the steps and waited for a doctor to come. And he remained conscious most of the time. I mean, fortunately, he did get a very sensible doctor who cleared out the wound and things. That wasn't the first doctor, but the second one. But he lived for many years afterwards. And of course, that was part of what excited people about how the brain works. And that too contributed to the start of psychology. Incidentally, the case of Phineas Gage generated an awful lot of theories because people wanted to believe certain things. So there were all sorts of accounts you'll find in books like, that he was violent and aggressive and cruel to his wife and children. Well, he didn't have any wife and children for a start. He was single man, and he was actually fairly placid. But he did get a period of being excited and enraged, but that was while he had a fever, when the the injury really set in. So lots of myths, and that's another thing I talk about in the book. It's the way myths grew up about this story. But it was part of the start of psychology as well. Psychology, like I say, not one single origin, several fathers, but also other influences as well.
Yeah. So in your book, where exactly do you start when it comes to the origin of psychology? Do we go all the way back to Pliny the Elder? Do we start off with Freud and his cohorts, or?
Well, we start off really with explaining why, although the ancient Greeks had a lot of thoughts about how people work, those were not really psychology.
Yeah.
Like psychology isn't just thinking about how the brain works and getting your own ideas.
Yeah.
Psychology, as we know it today, is about the finding out through scientific methods, through testing things, through working things out, through checking it out, and making sure that it actually really does apply, and it's not just your own ideas. And we know this. I mean, we've got lots of ideas that came through from the ancient Greeks, which we've accepted as gospel, which are just simply wrong. The idea that human beings have 5 senses, that's a classic. We teach that to primary kids, and it's really not true. We've got about 40 senses. We've got a sense which is all about sensing temperature. That's a separate sense in itself. And it's not just in the skin. I mean, we feel temperature. I mean, anybody who travels knows that.
Yeah.
And that is a distinct sense in the brain. We've got the internal senses of balance and proprioception and kinesthesia, which is all about how we move, all those sorts of things. So, and the problem with that is that because he only identified the 5 senses which bring in information from the external world, it gave the impression that we were separate from the external world and just receiving information from it.
Yeah.
Whereas if we'd included all these things about ourselves in relation to the world, we'd have had a very different image of how we relate. And of course, now, in these ecologically sensitive times, we can think that might have been a better way of looking at things, really.
Yeah. I completely agree. So when you were compiling all of your research for this book, the topic of psychology is so huge, and your book is a little history of psychology.
Yes.
How did you decide what to include and what to exclude from the book?
Okay. I have my very first book was called A First Course in Psychology, and it was written for college students who come to study psychology as adults but had failed at school and didn't really think they could learn anything. And so it was written for people who were not really used to education. And that's the level that I really like to write at, and to write to people who don't know, so I'm explaining, I'm telling stories. But anytime you write a textbook, you're picking and choosing bits of research, what's relevant, what's important. And I have a couple of filters. I mean, one is that I don't do the very latest trends, because the very latest, I've 50 years I've been in psychology, and I've been keeping up to date all the time, and I have seen trends. There was a period, for instance, when catastrophe theory was all the rage, and then 10 years later, what's catastrophe theory? Not important.
Could you explain catastrophe theory quickly for us?
I mean, it started with a mathematical theory, I think, which was all about the way, well, in psychology certainly it was the way that things don't progress smoothly as a progression, but sometimes they reach a point where they suddenly change. So for instance, if you look at stress, or excitement when you're doing something, to say you're doing archery or something, and excitement, up to a point, being a bit excited is going to help you do better. But then there can come a point where it actually really screws up what you do, and you can't do anymore, and you get really bad at it. So it's like a sudden falling off of performance in those terms. And it's a kind of mathematical model that people were using, and they were going, oh, wow, this explains lots. But actually, it didn't explain very much at all. And it's something, some things, but not much. And instead of being the answer to everything that any psychologist might want to know, it was sort of just another addition to the statistical modeling that we can use. So if I had put that into my textbook at the time, it would have seemed as though it was a really fantastic idea, whereas now it barely gets a mention. So over time, you have to look at what has had an impact over time. And one of the great things about doing this book is because I was looking back right over the 150, 160 years of psychology, maybe a bit longer.
Wow.
I could see how early trends had become apparent later, had their influence later. Like Alfred Adler, who was a student of Freud's initially, or colleague of Freud's initially, but developed his own idea about individual psychology. And that was in the 20s and 30s. But it wasn't until the 80s that Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis really started to put that into psychotherapy and really started to build a form of psychotherapy which wasn't about psychoanalysis like Freud's approach, but was about teaching people new ways of seeing how their lives are. The kind of therapy that we look to today.
Yeah.
But it took 50 years, the things happen when the time is right,
Yeah.
My publishers didn't like me using the phrase, it's steam engines when it's steam engine time. But it's absolutely right. The Romans had little steam engines, but they didn't use, they had little devices that showed how steam could power things, but they didn't develop steam engines because the economics weren't right, the time wasn't right, the whole society wasn't geared that way. And so with Adler, the time wasn't right for his individual psychology, but it became right later.
You go through so many different periods of psychology that I just didn't even really think about until looking at your book. Like you have global psychology, so psychology from different parts of the world. I found it particularly interesting because I live in Japan, and the psychology here is, from my personal experience, non-existent. And it's very different than what I've experienced living in the United States. So why did you decide to include that chapter in the book?
Okay, can I just say something about psychology in Japan?
Yeah.
Because it's not non-existent, it's built into things so firmly that you don't know them.
Really?
Really?
Okay.
Really.
I
Japanese
want to know.
Japanese psychology is really strong, but it's always been really strong in education and in industry. Really strong. And it's one of the reasons why Japanese education is so good and why Japanese industry is so good. Because the kind of management practices you get in Japan are very, very different from the kind of management practices you get in the West. And they're much more effective because they involve people, because they're based on psychology from the start. I went to the Japanese psychological annual convention last September, and wow, that was really fascinating. And I asked one of the professors what was the real strength, or what was one of the strengths of psychology in Japan, and he said, well, well-being at work, well-being generally. But the point about it is it's so influential that you're not aware of it being there. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It totally makes sense.
Yeah. So that's just a sideline. But why I chose to introduce global psychology is because I'm very aware that the take I have on psychology is a very Western perspective. But I'm also very aware that things are happening elsewhere. The Southeast Asian psychology is incredibly strong. African psychology is different. At the moment, as we have developed our global interactions, we've become aware of how different people are, as well as how much they have in common. And I think one of the things that's happening, well, I know one of the things that's happening is that people are starting to look at how psychology can mesh with their own indigenous knowledge and their indigenous and things. So this is, I said I didn't do current trends. I don't do current trends, but this is an ongoing movement. This is not something that's going to go away. And it's something that is actually going to strengthen psychology a huge amount, because you used to get things like, well, you get ideas that are very, very Western. We call them weird because they come from Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies, and the initials are weird. And they don't really represent most of the rest of humanity. Yeah. Take, for instance, the American concept, or a Western concept, American and British, of needs, and the idea that there's a need for achievement. There's lots of psychometrics about this, and the need for achievement is supposed to be a powerful basic need. Yeah. And it's completely meaningless in most societies. Most people just want to get on with their own lives, quite frankly. And the kind of need for achievement that is manifest in American society is there because it's encouraged. It's part of the culture. It's one of those things about you want to be successful. You want to be, because you're in the land of opportunity and you have that. You can do that. It's really not relevant for an awful lot of societies around the world. So it's a classic example of Western assumptions about human nature applied elsewhere. But that was one reason why I wanted to write about global psychology. And the other reason is because there are insights there that we haven't, well, two other reasons. One is that it developed in different ways with things like the Russian Revolution and the whole idea that psychology was actually a tool of the capitalist ideology and so on, and the alternatives. But the other was that there are people like Frantz Fanon in Africa. Well, his influence has been mostly in Africa, but they did so much to articulate what it meant to have colonialism. We're talking now about decolonizing the curriculum, the psychology curriculum. But the Fanon was a black, highly educated, highly intelligent psychiatrist and psychologist who wrote about identity and what it is to be black in a highly racist colonial society. And the way that actually the whole thing about self-image as taught in the West is irrelevant, because the concept is defined as much by society as you are by your own experiences. Yeah, I'm just trying to simplify it. But
no, yeah, it makes complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Fanon was hugely influential in other parts of the world and almost completely unheard of in the West, except through groups like the Black Panthers and the activist groups. But by and large, no, I mean, I only heard of him because I had a Marxist friend at university who introduced me to his books. I didn't hear about him through my psychology degree, but he has been hugely influential. And in Somalia, there's one of the universities is called the Frantz Fanon University. I mean, that tells you don't name a university after somebody unless they really are a big...
unless they've done something.
Yeah, so it was clear that Western psychology was missing out on things, and I wanted to flag that. And when I'd finished doing the book, the publishers sort of said, "Well, do you feel like doing another book?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to write a little geography of psychology." But they didn't think the general public would be interested in that.
Hey, if you need a petition, just let me know. My listeners, I'm sure, would be very, very excited about that. We can get it together and send it to you.
It'd be lovely, wouldn't it? I know, I'd really like it. Well, it's there on the back burner. You never know.
Yeah.
And I'm involved in a few international committees now and things, so I'm gathering material, all the time. But anyway, that's that may or may not happen in the future. But that's what I'd like to do, because psychology, it's indigenous psychologies aren't about throwing psychology away. They're about picking and choosing what's valid for us and using that, and then saying, and what else can we bring to the party? What other knowledge do we have?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have different people involved in things like psychology and history as well. Like,
yes.
Yeah. So this is, I am in complete agreement with you, Dr. Hayes.
I mean, I think, once you start looking at things in a historical context, you get a completely different message, don't you? And and a better understanding, a much better understanding.
I think so too. Yeah. An interdisciplinary look at both history and psychology. And that's one thing I really love about your book, is that it's not just one thing or the other. It's both. You get a very nice introduction into the history at the time, and then how psychology is adapting and changing despite and in spite of a lot of things that are happening at the time. So I really liked your book.
Thank you. It's a history of ideas rather than... I mean, you can find a lot of papers about psychology, histories of psychology in some books, but mostly they deal with who was on what committee and who founded what journal and so on. And I'm sorry, but that puts me to sleep. What I was writing about was how ideas have emerged. So you've got the ideas from Freud that emerged and were very influential in psychology up to probably about the Second World War, but then tended to branch off. Psychoanalysis now we wouldn't regard as psychology. We regard it as a separate discipline in itself. Yeah. So you wouldn't now count Freud as part of Western. Well, some would. This is my take on history, and for the most part, we wouldn't. You don't find Freud in many psychology textbooks nowadays. It's just it works on different kinds of evidence. What they count as evidence is not the same as the scientific evidence that modern psychology requires. So the people like Freud, people like the experimental people, like the medics, the ones looking at the brain, all these things, they come together, and then new areas evolve very quickly. Measuring personality emerged very quickly during the First World War, really, because of what was happening with people with shell shock and trauma. So they began to start measuring personality to see if there were some people who were more vulnerable than others. Not that it made a difference to the practice. Still patched them up and sent them back out. But it was evolved then into the industry of psychometrics.
In your book, one thing, we're talking about psychology developing and changing. One of the chapters in your book is on the computer coming into the world. I believe that chapter is called Enter the Computer, in fact.
Possibly.
Yeah. We were speaking a little bit before we hit record about your publishers in the past not being interested in, or saying that people wouldn't be interested in psychology, that there would be no market for your type of book. But now it's like people cannot get enough of psychology. No. And I think that it has a lot to do with the age of the computer and the smartphone now. So I just wanted to get your opinion on how social media has been affecting psychology. Have you seen any changes?
I've seen a continuation and an acceleration of a trend, because you attribute it to the computer, and I think that's part of it, but I attribute it to the growth of consumer society, which really exploded after the Second World War.
Yeah.
And the whole thing about consumerism, and it's about me. It's, the whole thing about lifestyle consumerism emerged, didn't it? Before, people were buying things, but they were buying things they needed, like cookers and what have you. And it was all about, have you got a hairdryer? Whereas now it's about, what kind of hairdryer do I particularly like? It's me.
Yeah.
It's much more focused. And I think that was part of the growing interest in psychology, because I think psychology, as a public interest, has been growing enormously since the 70s.
Yeah.
And then, yes, social media really blew that wide open. And I think, we have so much more awareness of each other, but also so much more opportunity to interact with each other. I often think, my daughter was growing up we live in quite an isolated little village, but it has a high school, and it's a very small high school, but she had a lot of friends, but she was an only child. But if she was cooking in the kitchen or something, I'd walk in the kitchen, the iPad would be there, and one of her friends would be there, and I'd be saying, hi Callum. She was never alone. She was always with other people, because through that, I'm also because she was out playing with her friends. When I was a kid, there was no such thing. There were phones and letters. My first boyfriend lived in another town, and we communicated through letters. So that's an alien thing which a lot of people don't understand, but you wrote on a piece of paper. Anyway, in some ways they've come back to a much more natural kind of environment for human beings, because if you think about how human beings evolved, we evolved in villages, maybe 200 people at a time, and everybody knew everybody, and you weren't alone. And one of the things that happened when people from those kind of communities started coming into the West to study was they got terribly alienated and terribly lost, because they were individual, and they weren't individual, they were part of their. So what's happened now is that you don't get the kind of isolated kids growing up and making models in attics, not as much as you ever did, because now those kids can make friends through a network. They can find other people who are interested in modeling. It's brought us back to a much more natural way of a way that suits us as human beings, as social people, much more. Yeah. So you go. There's a positive.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking, like, when you're on social media, you're hearing about how bad social media is for you. And this is such a refreshing look at the positive side of social media. Like, what even, podcasts aren't necessarily social media, but even now, you and I are talking to each other from completely different countries and places, and
different half of the world. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's nice to know.
It is nice there is a downside, but I blame that mostly on the algorithms that social media uses. This whole thing about only feeding you stuff you're already interested in just leads to echo chambers and extremism. I think that's a really, really dangerous thing, and I've thought that for many years. But you can't tell AI designers anything, really. But sometimes you can. I was working with some recently, and it was quite funny, because you'd have ordinary conversations about, how people are going to use this stuff. And they would go, wow, that's really interesting. I'd be saying, like, don't put that much text on a page, because people won't read it,
Yeah.
Really? Because a computer would. and that's what they understood. Yeah. So anyway, that's another story. But yeah, it has its downsides, but I think at the same time it has its positives, and making us human, helping us to be human is part of it.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna remember that next time I hear somebody besmirching social media.
Yeah, it's good and bad in everything. It's how we use it, It's an old story, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure they had the same debates when reading happened. Well, they did.
Yeah, the printing
and at least
press.
They're not burning people at the stake for wanting to read their own things.
Exactly. So in your book, you have a lot of different characters, not fictional characters, real characters, historical figures. And I want to know if there's any one that is maybe lesser known or the audience might find surprising that you'd like to talk about from your book.
Well, Caroline Sharif is one, actually. But there's within psychology, there's a very famous experiment called the Robbers Cave experiment, which was all about getting groups of kids either in competition with one another or working together. And it was really quite a useful experiment about conflict resolution and things. But it was always attributed to Mustafa Sharif, who was Caroline's husband, and he was very, very cross about it. He was very angry because actually it was Caroline who had developed the ideas, it was Caroline who developed the theory, but because of the sexism of the time, this is the 1950s and 60s, she wasn't allowed to publish anything in her own name, and she wasn't allowed an academic career. And it was just like there were women who did have at that time, but they weren't, she wasn't in that particular pocket of society which allowed it, and most of society didn't. And I think he, as I say, he was very angry that he had to take the credit for what wasn't his. And I think I have tried to put that balance right a bit in what I've written lately, because I think it's one of those stories. I go for stories that are typical. That's a typical story, things that happened. I had a young researcher recently asking me about what it was like in the 70s and 80s, and I said, well, let's put it this way: it's no accident that I have an androgynous name, because if I had published my first book as Nikki Hayes, nobody would have read it. Yeah, it wouldn't have got the credit when it was Nikki Hayes. It might have been male, and in fact, for many years, I had people coming up and apologizing for assuming I was male. As in, not my problem, not my problem at all. But that's how sexist it was in the 70s and 80s. It was really bad. And yes, there were people who overcame it. I had two very high achieving sisters, and there were lots of eminent professors and people. Well, not lots, but it was becoming more and more common for women to become. But they had to work so much harder than the men. And it's much, much more balanced now. Much more balanced. But yeah, Caroline Sharif is one. I think there is Wilhelm Wundt, who is well established as the founding father of psychology, also wrote a 10-volume version of book on social psychology. And that has never been recognized, partly because only 2 volumes were ever translated into English, because he wrote in German, partly because the title was mistranslated as cultural psychology, whereas he meant social psychology. But he thought social psychology should encompass things like religion and, other aspects of society.
I'm sorry, there's an earthquake coming. Hi, Editing TK here, real quick, just to apologize for the jump and the discombobulation in the conversation. There was an earthquake in the middle of our interview, and we had to pause for like 20 minutes while the earthquake went by and while I calmed down a little bit. So I apologize since the conversation is a little bit disjointed here, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. And with that, I will let you get back to the episode. Okay, love you, bye. So I guess we'll go through to the misconceptions and myths, because I feel like that would be a good segue, if that's okay with you.
I mean, there's the inevitable European-American conflict, where I have read some papers where they're saying, oh, William James was the first psychologist, not Wilhelm Wundt, because he had a cupboard in Harvard that he stored psychological equipment in, before. That's just little conflicts, like a bit like when you look at the history of space exploration, is it America or is it Russia, different sides have different, anyway. But no, I'm not really aware of myths about the history of psychology. I'm aware of quite a lot of myths about modern psychology, which I aim to correct. And one of them, of course, is the is that modern psychology is all about Freud and psychoanalysis, which it isn't. Not now.
Yeah.
It was a very important part of the development of psychology in the first half of the 20th century, but much less so now. I think there's a lot of mythology. Well, certainly when I was a student, there was an awful lot of speculation and gossip about the role of the CIA and the unnatural experiments they did on drugs and things. Loads of that.
Yes.
The trouble with that is it turns out not to be myths at all, but actually true. That's what's really frightening. And we only know that because, well, we wouldn't know that at all if when Watergate happened, they uncovered a lot of files that were supposed to be secret, and that was really what did Nixon in as president. But so at that time, the president, the head of the CIA, got a bit panicky and said, "Destroy all, get rid." And he did. You see, fortunately, some of them had been misfiled in another building, so they weren't destroyed. And they are the evidence we have that MK Ultra really happened. We don't have a fraction of what else happened, and the problem with that is that, I mean, those were the origins of some of the major conspiracy theories, and the real problem is that they were true, so they have convinced conspiracy theorists ever since that all the other conspiracies must be true as well. But they really did some horrible things, and they did quite a lot of horrible things that we're not even really aware of. There are, if you Google it, you come across all sorts of accounts and which are impossible to verify.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of stuff that has been verified, and we know, they were experimenting with sensory deprivation, with torture, with brainwashing, with drugs, giving people LSD and things without them knowing it, all sorts of things like that. And I do talk about that in the book, I mean, as much as I can.
Yeah.
And that's, as I say, but they're not really, as I say, misconceptions or myths. They're just bits of psychological history, which I think a lot of people would like to wipe out. But I'm not in favour of cancelling history. I think there's the old thing about those who don't know about their history are condemned to repeat it, or something like that. There's some kind of phrase. So, I think we just have to recognise that happened.
I'm in complete agreement. Yeah. So when you were researching, was there anything that you found challenging when you were gathering your information? Like any roadblocks you encountered or anything that was difficult? You
see, the problem is that I've been gathering that information for 50 years. It wasn't the case that I suddenly sat down and thought, right, let's think about history of psychology.
Yeah.
It's the case that I sat down when the publishers asked me if I wanted to write the book. I went, this would be really interesting. Yeah. And then they gave me this really good brief, which was 40 chapters, 2,000 words per chapter. And that's brilliant because that's nice and bite-sized. 2,000 words you can read, that's 4 or 5 pages. You read that, put it down.
Good to go.
It gives you structure. It gives you structure right through. But I have lived 50 years, so a third of psychology's history myself. I'd seen the changes from when I was a student right through, all the different changes, positive psychology. I remember going to a lecture where Albert Bandura, one of the most famous names in psychology, was proposing a new theory, a radical new theory that had not been done before, and that was in 1989, and that was self-efficacy theory.
Wow.
Which is now common sense, isn't it? It's now every day.
So
but when he was proposing it, it was completely new and completely radical. Yeah?
Yeah.
A new approach. So I've seen so many changes in my own lifetime. And it was fascinating to be able to go back and look at the others. I knew, dimly about Helmholtz and Wundt and people like that, and William James, of course. But going back and looking more carefully, like going back and looking at reading the paper of the Little Albert study, which everybody knew about Little Albert, the idea that this child had been conditioned into a phobia.
Yeah.
But reading the paper was, wow, this is amazing. It was actually quite shocking. Really shocking. I mean, the story of Little Albert, which, was that the researchers who were arch behaviourists, well, J.B. Watson was the behaviourist who founded the whole movement, but what they did was to take a very phlegmatic child and he had toys, he would play with his toys, and one of them was a pet, which was a white rat, which he liked to stroke and play with. And so what they did was, each time he touched the rat, they came up behind him and hit an iron bar with a hammer. Make a big noise. Child was 11 months old, naturally fell over, startled,
Yeah.
cried.
Yeah.
And they did this a few times, and after a while he got phobic about he wouldn't want to,
The rat.
didn't want to touch the rat. Then he didn't want to touch anything that was white and furry, anything at all. And so what they'd done was to induce a phobia. Okay, so we learned about that in school, in college, when we were learning about learning theory and things. Reading the paper is what horrified me, because, well, I mean, the experiment horrified me as well. I mean, but this is 1920s, before they had ethics, ethical principles. But they were so jubilant about it because they were challenging Freud's idea that when an adult has a phobia, it's come from an internal suppressed wish fulfillment or conflict or Oedipus complex or whatever. And the psychoanalysts insist that phobias came from deeply buried things. And what Watson and Rayner were going was, look, we've made a phobia just by learning, no thought to the child, no thought to anything. They were just, this is one in the eye for the psychoanalysts.
Oh my gosh.
I know. And I found that really disgusting. And it really comes through in the paper, because in those days they wrote papers in English, you could read them. It wasn't like psychological jargon as all other disciplines have come to do as well. But yeah, it was, so there was an enrichment of going back and looking again at these things that I knew about, but getting more detail, getting more information. And it really, I mean, I knew that the whole thing had really highlighted ethical issues. Yeah. But just the jubilation in this paper, this is one of the, and no thought to the child, no thought to anything.
Wild.
Look, we've given this child a phobia, isn't it great?
Okay, now what are you going to do to help that child? Nothing
after
No. Oh my gosh.
No. His mother took him out of the experiment. His mother took him away, quite rightly, if you ask me. They took a child who was completely phlegmatic, calm, never upset by anything, and turned him into a nervous wreck, effectively. Well, perhaps that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's
terrible.
Awful.
Yeah, you got that, and you got, when you're talking about psychology ethics, you see, you got that, and you got the MK Ultra studies and things like that. And it's really no wonder that in the 80s, people started to say, look, we need proper ethical codes for researchers. Let's get those going. And I think that too ties in with the 80s and the focus on individuals and people's rights and me, in that sense.
Yeah. But so it's so interesting that you said earlier that you've been in psychology for a third of psychology's history. Yeah. So I would love to know what you see for the future of psychology. Do you think that based on the historical trends, what might be our future in psychology? What are the next significant shifts in the field, do you think?
Okay. One of them is learning to relax with diversity. I think one of the things that many psychologist students go through, and most of them, in fact, is that when you first really start to study psychology in depth, basically your world gets torn apart, because where you were looking for answers or single factors and things like that, you find there aren't any. There are lots of things that contribute. And so you have to abandon what you previously thought and develop your own synthesis. And that's the thing that is important. And psychologists are by and large happy with the idea of multiple causes of things. And that, in a sense, that makes them fairly distinctive, because most people are always looking for the cause. Yeah. And there isn't, not when you deal with people. People are far too complex, Yeah. And there's different levels of explanation. You take even one thing, say something like a birthday. How many levels of explanation have you got for that? You've got the whole symbolic thing, you've got the whole personal thing, you've got the self-concept thing. How did I get that old? And all that. Yeah, but yeah, so I think that's what we have to do, is what we have done, what we achieve as individuals. But what we need to achieve as a discipline is coming to terms with the fact that there are diverse types of psychology. We've never had one single psychology. All through psychology's origins, there have been different schools of thought going on. And we need to recognize that is how psychology is. And if you're in another culture, it's a different kind of psychology. It still has some of the roots of the psychology we know. So I think that's an important part of it. And that ties in with decolonization, and it ties in with indigenous psychologists and all that sort of things. That's one of the things that's going to happen in the future, and that psychologists are going to have to come to terms with, and not try to put them into little boxes and brackets and things. Just come to terms with that's how the world is. But then that also brings with it another need, and I've just started to start to talk about this, is the need for an integrative psychology. So we need to be able to integrate and consolidate all these different areas of knowledge so that we can come to terms with, so we can communicate it a bit better, actually. Because one of the things we're terribly bad at is communicating with politicians and decision makers and people. We're not, and the reason for that is, and it was put very clearly by the president of the European Federation of Psychology Associations recently. He said the one thing that they don't want to hear if they ask you a question is, it depends. And that's the one thing that psychologists always want to say. And we have to learn how to because we know things. It's not that it depends in the sense that nobody knows. It's that we know that it's complex factors all contributing to it. So we need to learn how to talk with politicians and people who are far too busy to know the complexities. And the medics don't have a problem with that. You can have medics who will be absolutely certain in what they're saying, even though they know that half the medical profession doesn't agree with them. They don't have a problem with that. And we shouldn't have a problem with that either. But we always think, somebody's going to come along and say, that's not right. And we need to learn that depending on the audience, if you're talking to your peers, of course you need to be aware of that. If you're talking to a decision maker, what they want to know is what is some useful information that they can use. And so you need to be able to distill it down and say, right, this is a thing you need to think about.
I don't have experience with that on such a grand scale, but when I was a classroom teacher, I was the social emotional needs lead, and telling parents and telling principals and telling other classroom teachers, well, it depends, was not my favorite
what's
thing.
Causing it, don't they? They want to know a single thing. And it isn't a single thing.
And there's no one single solution, no one single situation. Absolutely.
It's the whole thing is just, it's complex because people are complex. People are not simple things, and that's the point about psychology, is that it's trying to come to grips with that. People are complex. The behaviorists thought they had the answer to everything in this simple learning model they had, and they were wrong. And anybody who thinks they've got a simple answer to anything is wrong. Because we're more complex than that. And it's the same way that anybody who thinks they've got a single view of history is wrong, aren't they?
Exactly.
History is a lot more complex than that.
So much more complex.
Because that's people too. And people bring their own understandings to things, and they don't necessarily act in the ways that you think would be logical. They act according to the beliefs they have at the time.
Exactly. Your logical is not always everyone else's logical. So, Dr. Hayes, to bring this interview to a close, I'd love to know if readers could take away just one key insight or lesson from A Little History of Psychology, what would you hope it would be? I
think I would hope that they would bear in mind that other people are acting sensibly according to what they believe. So if there's somebody who's doing something that irritates you, they're not doing it to irritate you. They're doing it because in their own minds, that is logical for how they see things. Does that make sense?
It 1,000% makes sense. Yes.
I think if we can live with that, we can understand a lot more, because we see things happening and we think, how can people do that? Well, the reason they can do that is because to them it makes sense. So understanding where they're coming from helps us to get along better, I think. Sometimes. I hope so anyway. I mean, psychology ought to be about helping people to flourish, and we try to.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today and going with me through that earthquake. I appreciate it so much. Just for our listeners, once again, this book is A Little History of Psychology, and you can pick it up wherever you pick up your favorite books. And Dr. Hayes has it right here. It's a lovely cover. It's really, really cool. And it has a phrenology.
I didn't do the pictures.
On the top,
the publishers did the pictures, but they're very, very good. I'm very happy with them.
And they really are. I love it. So
nice, bite-sized, and readable.
Yeah, it is. It's great. I am a very slow reader, but I read this very quickly. It's digestible. You don't have to be an expert in
No.
psychology to understand this book at all. And I think it's a wonderful read for anybody who is looking to learn a little bit more about psychology and the world and history. So thank you again, Dr. Hayes. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, I'm so glad. And I will see you in the outro. Bye. Well, my delicious donut, thank you so much for joining me for this season break episode. And an extra special thank you to Dr. Nikki Hayes for dealing with that earthquake with me. I really appreciate that and appreciate her coming on and speaking about her book. It is fantastic. And once again, that is a little history of psychology. We are still on our season break until January, but that does not mean that you can't still support For the Love of History podcast. Why don't you send this episode or any episode to your friend, copy the link, send it off to your history bestie or somebody who you think needs to be converted into a delicious donut. You can also leave a rating or review. Let me know what you're doing when you're listening to For the Love of History when you leave your review. Is it a perfect podcast for doing the dishes to, commuting to work to, grocery shopping to? Let me know. And don't forget that you can also get some amazing merch. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can join us over on Patreon for ad-free listening, bonus content, early releases, and so much more. Okay, I think that's about it. Don't forget to drink your water, take good care of yourself. It's getting cold, okay? So have some vitamin C in whatever way you imbibe in vitamin C, because that helps with your little immune system, and you need to stay healthy because it's getting cold, okay? All right, drink your water. I love you so much, and I will see you, well, kind of see you next week, okay? Love you. Bye. I ran out of breath.